Alright, so in this video we're going to add animations to our little dog character here. I have animations set up for you, so we're just going to plug those in and call them in code. So with our dog, if you're in the default layout, then we can pull up an animation window. So under window, animation. I like to dock that at the bottom here because it's nice to see keyframes in a wider view. So since the dog doesn't have any animations attached to it right now, we can hit create. And we'll save our animations under the animations folder. I'm going to just end up deleting this one, so I'll just name it new animation. But whenever we add, when we create a new animation, a new animator is set up for us on the game object that we're creating an animation for. So that's really useful. With this dog here, I can double click and it'll open up the animator. The animator is a window that gives us basically a state machine for different animations. So there's some these over here are useful for moving between any state, whatever the first animation is that's being called. And with this one we're going to delete, right? So we'll have no animations, but we'll have an animator set up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the project view, and I'm going to drag. I can delete this new animation because I don't need it. But some of these animations that we have here, I guess you wouldn't know. These should have been more informative. But I have an idle animation ready for you. So we can drag that into the animator. It'll be the default. And if we go into here and we go into the animation window and hit play, we can see what I've set up here. So basically I have a dog sprite, and he kind of just like wags his tail and barks a little bit. Just overall cute. So right now we have one animation hooked up already. The next one that I'm going to do is I'm going to do the dog's attack, which is just called attack. So I'm going to drag and drop that. And now we need a way for us to call this animation because it's not the default animation. So to be able to call this animation, I can make a transition from one animation state to the next. So if I click make transition and drag that onto attack here, the default is for it to do it at a certain amount of time, but I want to do it when I click the mouse button down. So to be able to do that, I can specify a condition. So when I've made a transition, I can click on the arrow and I can edit how or when this transition is called. To be able to call this, I can make a parameter and hit the plus key to create a new parameter. And I'm going to create an animation trigger. So it's going to be the attack. I'm just going to call it attack to trigger the attack. And in our conditions here, I can include a new condition. So if we've triggered attack, it'll trigger this animation. Now that I'm triggering it, I don't need it to happen within a certain amount of time, so I'm going to zero these out and make sure that there's no exit time, and so it'll instantly happen. So it's very snappy. I just made it another transition back because once we've attacked, we want to go back into the idle state. And this one we can do within a certain amount of time. And for pixel art games, where I'm not really concerned with transitions between animations. I just make the exit time 1, transition 0, and it doesn't matter if this is 0 if we have this selected or not. So after the animation is fully completed, it'll go back into idle. And we can see a preview of that here. So it'll attack and then it'll go back to idle. So the attack, if we see here and we play it, he turns red and he just kind of goes around in a circle. Okay. So if I drag and drop this animator and snap it here, and I have my parameter that I can look at in the scene, if I look at it, this is going to be a little tough because he follows the cursor. What if I... Okay. Barely. If I can trigger this here, then it, like, I can manually trigger the attack to happen. So that's cool. All right. But I want to be able to do this in code. So if I go back into our dog controller script, on update we can check for an input if we've hit the mouse button, and then we can trigger that animation. So how I'll do that is I will I'll declare an animator up here, an animator anim, and under start we have to specify what anim means. So anim is, we're gonna get the component, the animator that's attached to our dog game object. So when we use get component, if this script is attached to the game object, it's gonna look for a component called animator or the animator component that's attached to our game object in Unity. And since we made that animation, we should have an animator here that it will go ahead and grab this. So when we say anim from now on, it means that animator. Now down here, my pseudocode, I'm going to say if mouse button is pressed, attack. To check for our input, we'll say if, and then we'll do open parentheses, input dot get mouse button down. So if we get mouse button down, it gets the first frame in which we've pressed down the button. If we get mouse button, then it will, since it's on update, it will constantly get whenever the mouse button is being held down. So what we want, mouse button down, and we have to specify if it's the left or right. So we want the left, and so that'll be 0. And if this is true, if this condition is met, if we've hit the mouse, if it's the first frame in which we've hit the mouse button down, then anim, we can set the trigger to be true. So we say anim.setTrigger, and we say attack. So now it should trigger that attack, and I think this should work now. So if we Control S, hit save, and we go back into the scene, hit play. We move the dog around, and when we click down, he'll attack. I'm going to move the animator back to where it was. Alright, at this point we have an idle and we have an attack, but I also have animation set up for him to move upwards and to the left and to the right and down. And the way we're going to handle that is in Animator, under our idle animation, I can change this to be a blend state. So if I say create new blend tree in state and I double click, you can see that there's a blend tree in here, and there's different layers that we can select from. So we have an additional layer within our idle. I'm going to rename idle to just be movement, and we'll contain the idle animation in our blend tree. So a blend tree allows us to transition between several different animation states depending on a certain condition. So if I look at blend tree, there's a blend type 1D, and what that means is that it will consider one value by default is from a float from 0 to 1 in determining what animation state to play. But we could do two different ones. So if I say 2D simple directional, I can have two different parameters that in which we'll use the Y direction and the X direction to determine what animation to play. So for this blend tree, I have idle, I have run left, run right, run down, and run up. So I have 5 different motions I want to blend between. So I'm going to add 5 different motion fields. And for our parameters, they created one blend for us here, but we actually want 2 different floats. So we'll have one that's the Y direction, just to keep consistent with my naming conventions. I'm gonna do camel case. I kind of like to keep them short names too, so wider. And I'll do exter. And now with these, I can have an exter and a wider. So depending on the X direction, from -1 to 0, and the Y direction from 0 to 0.5 for some reason. As the default, we can move these different animation states and trigger different ones depending on the location. So this is our simulation of what these 2 values are. Alright, so for these motion fields, I'm going to start with idle. I'm going to move down to run up, and run down, and run left, and run right. So this idle is oh, it's in the middle, so that's perfect. This run up, where is this guy? I actually want him to be up here. Run down, I want to be down here. Run left, I want to be on my left. Run right to be on my right. And I'm going to make this, I'm going to clean this up. So if my X position, basically if I'm at 0, 0, then I want it to be idle. If I want for run up, if it's anywhere from 0.01 to 1, we might adjust this later to be less sensitive. Then I want it to be in my run up. So from run down, if it's -0.01 to -1, then I want to transition into my running down. For left, for the, oh, you know what? I messed up. So this is just we're just concerned about the Y position. So these can all be 0. So as long as so if my Y position is at 1 or -1, then we can transition into those states. But I don't want since I'm going to feed in a normalized vector, which means a vector in terms of floats that go from -1 to 1. This is it requires too much for it to be a perfect. It has to be perfectly 1 for it to trigger this animation. So I'm going to do a halfway point. I'm going to say 0.5. And this one I'm going to be -0.5. For run left and run right, we don't care about the y value, so we can zero those out. But this one's going to be -0.5, and this run right is going to be 0.5. So now we can like mess around with this from -0.5 to 0.5, this 0.5 to -0.5, 0, 0, and we can see it highlighting the different animation states depending on where we're at. I think it's too sensitive for idle 2. We'll see when we start coding this up. So now we can set a trigger, and we can set different floats depending on our position. And to trigger certain animations, we're going to determine which direction the dog is going based off its current position and its last position. So if I hit play and I move from the left to the right, I want to trigger a right run animation if the previous position I had was more to the left than the current position that I have. So what we can do is we can save, so in our pseudocode, we can save our last position, and we'll do just like the cursor position, we'll do a vector 3. We'll call it previous pause for position, and we're just going to save the transform position of this guy. Once we've updated the position of the dog over here, now we can determine the direction by finding difference between positions. So we'll do another vector 3 direction, and we'll say that is going to equal our current position, transform.position, minus our previous position. Oops, I hit Control Copy and Paste. So just hitting Control S there. Once we've got our direction, we can feed in our floats. They're called Xstar and Wider. We can go back into this guy, and we will. So direction. We can get the difference between the position, but we also want to have this in terms of ones and zeros, from -1 to 1. So we'll a way we can do that is we can say direction is now direction normalized, and normalized will return a vector with a magnitude of 1. That way we know the maximum we can ever get for any of our values we feed in is 1. Now we can set those floats in the animator, so we can say anim.setFloat, and then we feed in Xster, and for this function to work, we have to feed in a value, so we say direction.x. Same for y, so anim.setFloat. collider direction dot y. Okay, I think we're at a point where we can test this out. Cool, looks like it's working. So running down, running up, running right, running left, can attack. At any moment, this is important too, in our blend state. So at any movement, whether it's idle or running left, right, up, or down, if I hit the attack trigger, I'm going to transition into an attack animation, then go back into movement. Cool, he's basically all set up.